there are now more than 100,000, including many of you, educators across the country who access free People's History lessons for middle and high school classrooms from the Zinn Education Project website. So I'm happy to be in conversation today with our guest historian and author, Jeanne Theoharis. And before I launch into our conversation, we want to find out who is in the room and go through our plans for our time together here today. And we are going to do a quick poll to find out how many teachers and educators and librarians and teacher educators and historians or parents, students are in the room with us today. So you might see the poll pop up on your screen there. And many of you are in multiple roles, so then just pick the primary role that you play. And educator Sierra Keller-Jones works with Teaching for Change and will post a poll for you to respond to now. So you might see that. Click the one that best describes you. All right. And we'll use these kind of polls a couple times during the session. So you might notice a question that comes up and you can just respond to it so we can get a sense of what people are thinking or their experience. And throughout the session, we want you to use the chat box to post questions or comments, resources, or just give ideas. And we'll read your questions and we'll try to respond after the breakout groups to some of those questions. Hopefully we'll have time for that, and we'll do a short evaluation at the end. So make sure you stick around and fill out the evaluation. And so we're ready to start our conversation. After about 20 minutes, we'll pause so that you can meet each other in small groups, I think for about 10 minutes, and we'll share insights. Oh, there's the results to our polls. So we have 45% teachers, 35% students. We have primary family member caregiver, 2%. We have 11% teacher educators and 7% other. Well, so glad to have you all with us here today. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with Professor Jeanne Theoharis. She got in touch with me last year to help. She wanted to speak to the Black Student Union at the high school that I work at because she is creating a young adult version of her book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And she wanted to get student feedback and input about how to best translate her book into a YA edition. And that was an incredible experience and opportunity for us to work with her in that project throughout the year. So I want to welcome Jeanne Theoharis.
Great to be here. And I'm excited for our conversation today.
No doubt, me too. So let's just jump right into it. You know, I want to start with the master narratives that are told about the civil rights movement, right. Because I think there's so many things that we are mistaught about the civil rights movement. And so there's a master narrative about the civil rights movement that it was the product of great men. And you have a chapter in your book about the great man myth, and take it down so brilliantly in many ways. But I think we should acknowledge there are certainly great men who were part of leading the civil rights movement, right? Martin Luther King, we can talk about Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, or Bayard Rustin, who actually, he often gets left out of the discussion of the great men because him being gay, his sexuality has often meant that he's invisibilized in the movement. But there are several things wrong with this master narrative, I would say. First, it often leaves out the leading role of women in the movement, like Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Septima Clark, Joanne Robinson, Rosa Parks. I mean, we could go on and on about the women who really organized and led the struggles all across the country. But it also erases the collective nature, right? When we say that the changes were made by great men here or there, it erases the collective nature of the struggle and the collaborations of millions of people whose names we don't even know, who were critical to winning the advances of the civil rights movement. And I think what we want to focus on today is the fact that this great man myth misses the critical role that young people played in the movement. So I'm hoping you can talk about the master narratives about the civil rights movement and how they are used to both obscure the role of young people in the movements and also how the civil rights movement is kind of weaponized, as you say in the book, against young activists today.
Right. So I think one of the ways we really get the civil rights movement wrong is that we miss at so many key junctures how young people actually take it forward, and take it forward at times against the wishes of their parents, against the wishes of their teachers, against the wishes of, or the common sense of adults in the community. And that again, so many moments that we even have heard of actually have young people at the lead. And I want to talk about a couple. The first is Brown versus Board of Education. I would bet everyone in this class today has heard of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 Supreme Court decision. But that case is actually the product of 5 cases, right? That went to the Supreme Court. Here's a case. It's actually a number of cases rolled into one. So Brown is 5 cases. And one of the cases in Brown, a case that came out of Prince Edward County, Virginia, actually began by a high school student strike led by a 16-year-old by the name of Barbara Johns.
Barbara Johns is just incredible.
She's incredible. She's just, right? And part of what's really interesting about Barbara Johns and her friends is some of her friends are working at the white high school at, like, that's their job after school. And they realize that the white high school in town, and this is in Virginia, is much nicer than their high school. And so Barbara Johns thinks that's very unfair, and she thinks, well, we should go on strike. They go to Moton High School. So they decide to organize a strike, and they call the NAACP for help. And the NAACP, the national office, decides to send down a couple of lawyers to basically tell these young people, don't do that. You're going to just get in trouble. You're going to get hurt. This is not the place to do it. It's going to be too violent. And these young people are just not deterred. And so these lawyers from the NAACP come down, and they can't stop Barbara Johns, and they can't stop these striking students. And so in fact, these striking students turn the NAACP lawyers around and decide, and basically this becomes one of the cases in Brown, right? And so the lawyers and the students and their parents agree to be a case to push forward this challenge that the national NAACP is now mounting against school segregation. But that it starts with a high school student strike because their high school isn't equal to the other high school in town. Except that's not how we learn the story of Brown. We don't learn the story of Brown as partly a story of the courage of teenagers.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like, of course, we can't learn about it in terms of the courage of teenagers, because the way that we're taught to understand change in society is we have to leave it up to the experts. So the civil rights movement was launched by lawyers who negotiated this in court. And in fact, when we dig deeper, that story is just brilliant about how teenagers led a walkout that was really one of the catalysts for the entire civil rights movement. And then you write in A More Beautiful and Terrible History, which everybody should get this book, that just systematically debunks all of the master narratives of the civil rights movement. But you write, even though many civil rights memorials are aimed at uplifting youth, the central role young people played in the Black freedom struggle from Brown to Birmingham to the Los Angeles blowouts is often omitted. So maybe you can tell us about some of those other struggles as well.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things just to underline, and the way that, as you were saying, I think sometimes the civil rights movement gets weaponized against us today, is that if you do learn about the role that either high school students or college students play in the civil rights movement, it's now kind of, the edges are sanded off. And so it seems like everybody supported them, when in fact at the time, a lot of adults found their confrontational activism scary. They found it not the right way to go about it. Similar kinds of criticisms that are waged against Black Lives Matter today were waged against these young people, whether it was Barbara Johns, whether it was the student sit-ins in 1960 that lead to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, whether it is the high school student strikes, and we're going to talk more about that, that many times when young people take this more kind of confrontational action, adults are like, no, 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 that's not the right way to do it. Similar to like the kinds of criticisms we heard about, and we continue to hear about Black Lives Matter, oh, you're not going about it the right way. And I think that's very dangerous, because I think it both misses how the civil rights movement actually proceeded and the kinds of tactics that actually push the movement forward, and not being kind of honest about the ways that even during the civil rights movement, lots of people were like, no, 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 that's not the right way to go about it, but young people pushed forward anyways. And certainly there were older people who were supportive of that, right? So as you mentioned, Ella Baker, people like Ella Baker very much, Rosa Parks mentored kind of younger activists because they so appreciated that spirit of that energy, that militancy. So it's not that there are no older people who are with these young people, but there were also older people who were like, no, 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 don't do that like that.
Right, right, absolutely. Do you want to tell us about a couple of those other stories too?
Sure.
Birmingham,
Yeah.
Los Angeles.
Yeah. Well, let's start in Montgomery, because, you know, I can never get past Montgomery. So most of us, I think, now have heard of Claudette Colvin, right? Claudette Colvin is the 15-year-old in Montgomery, 8 months before Rosa Parks, who refuses to give up her seat on the bus, is arrested. Montgomery's Black community for a time kind of organizes with her around her case, but ultimately decides not to push forward with a kind of a boycott or a legal case in her case. And that's the way we've now started to tell Colvin's story. And Colvin, I think, is increasingly part of how we tell the story of Montgomery, except we actually miss the second half of her story, which is that. So Rosa Parks makes her stand, they decide to pursue a legal case. In Rosa Parks's case, she decides to, but this is a state case. Rosa Parks's case is a state case. And one of the things they'd learned years before with a case by another woman by the name of Viola White is the state would often tie up these cases in state court and not let them go up on appeal. And so the lawyer for Rosa Parks, a young 25-year-old named Fred Gray, decides, you know what we're going to do? We're going to file a case directly into federal court to try to get around this tactic of the state. And he wanted plaintiffs for that case. And he wanted a minister on that case. And no minister is willing to be on this case that Gray is going to file into federal court. 4 women are on that case. The case, the title woman is a 38-year-old midwife by the name of Aurelia Browder. There's an older woman on it, and there are 2 teenagers on that case, Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith. So 4 women are on that federal case. No men, no ministers. They don't want to be associated with, you know, it's too scary, right? But 2 teenagers. And I think we don't always tell the full story of Colvin and the courage she summons that second time to be willing to be on that federal case. And it is that federal case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court and leads to the desegregation of Montgomery's buses.
Wow.
And so I think, again, we miss, even in these moments that we think we know, we miss the role of young people, right? You mentioned Birmingham, right? What actually galvanizes like John F. Kennedy's attention, right, and gets the federal government to act in the spring of 1963 is that young people start to join and are part of the downtown protests and are getting arrested day after day after day. And it's controversial. People are very critical of King, of the SCLC, for letting young people be part of it. They're arrested in huge numbers, but in many ways, it is those young people, because there weren't enough adults willing to do that really take the movement in Birmingham forward in 1963. Yeah.
I mean, that is so inspiring to know. And feel like just being reminded of these stories makes me want to redouble my efforts when schools reopen and make sure that my students learn all of these stories. And I thought maybe I could squeeze one more question in before the final question, just about the role of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because I think it often also gets left out or briefly mentioned in textbooks as one of the players in the civil rights movement, and yet so much of the civil rights movement was organized by young people in the organization.
Right, right. And a couple of things about SNCC, right? And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, but it's pronounced SNCC, just so if you've read it and you hear people saying SNCC, it's the same word. So SNCC is really started again by teenagers, by college students, right? Basically, in February of 1960, 4 college freshmen in Greensboro, North Carolina, decide that they're tired of the ways that Black people can shop at downtown stores, but they're not served equally, so they can't go to the lunch counter, but that these stores are willing to take their money. And they're also tired of people talking about how it's an injustice, but not acting. They're sort of fed up with the older generation for just kind of, for not really willing to kind of confront it head on. So these 4 friends go down to the Woolworth. They ask to be seated. Before they do so, I should say, they buy some school supplies because they want to demonstrate that they're willing to take their money, but not let them eat at the counter. And then they ask to be served, and they basically say they're not going to leave until they are served. And then Woolworth's like, oh, they're going to go away. So that first day, they just kind of ignore them. And then they go back, and word of their protest has reached campus. They go to North Carolina A&T. And so the next day, those 4 are joined by 23 others, including young women students at the kind of a Black women's college in Greensboro named Bennett College. So 4 has now become 27. By the next day, it's 63. By the next day, they're overflowing Woolworths and they're at Crest. By the next week, there are sit-ins now, not just in Greensboro, but in Raleigh and in Durham. And these sit-ins spread across many cities and towns. And it is these young people, these college teenagers, or early 20s, who then come together in April 1960 to form SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Ella Baker plays a huge role there too in making sure, even though she uses money from the SCLC to get the meeting started, she doesn't want the young people to be subsumed in these older organizations. She wants
didn't she actually have to argue with Martin Luther King that SNCC should be a separate organization and students should have their own right
separate place? Yeah, because I think she was worried, for good reason, that their energy and their vision would be constrained if they became just a kind of youth branch of the SCLC or the NAACP. And so SNCC will really push the struggle forward, particularly around voting rights, right? Around building freedom schools, around really cultivating local leadership in many places across the Deep South. But it's the work, again, of 18, 19, 20-year-olds. And I think sometimes when SNCC kind of becomes part of the narrative of how we tell the civil rights movement, we forget that these are actually 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are doing it. Right.
Incredible courage and political vision as well.
Absolutely.
And leadership that SNCC played in the civil rights movement. Thank you for sharing that. And it also just made me think that, yes, I think teenagers were some of the backbone of the civil rights movement, but you even have examples like Ruby Bridges of very young people playing an important role in the movement.
Yeah.
Ruby Bridges came to Seattle just a few years ago to give a speech at one of the local schools, John Muir Elementary School. And she inspired them to launch Black Lives Matter at School, which now is a national movement. So maybe you could just say a word about Ruby, and then I'll ask my last question.
Well, again, I think when we think about school, and again, most schools refuse to desegregate, but again, if we think about the halting wave of school desegregation that happened both in the 50s and increasingly in the 60s, right? That's tiny, tiny people, right? Like going into situations, right? Whether it's Ruby Bridges, whether it's what happens in Little Rock, whether it's, you know, who are, and people have written about how many of those young people were actually young women.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, sorry.
No, okay, cool. Well, I want to ask a question that gets at our reality today, because I think, and you point this out in your book a lot, but young Black Lives Matter activists today are often chastised for not following the blueprint of the civil rights movement and being too strident in their criticism of police brutality.
Right.
And as you write in A More Beautiful and Terrible History, quote, CNN's Wolf Blitzer, excuse me, criticized protests in Baltimore as not being in, quote, in the tradition of Martin Luther King, and Atlanta Mayor Cassim Reed invoked the history of King to celebrate Atlanta's tradition of free speech, but then admonished protesters Dr. King would never take the freeway. So maybe you could tell us about some of the militant protests that students actually did lead in this era. You know, junior high and high school walkouts and protests in the late 60s and 70s from LA to Boston. And what were their demands? I was really amazed by how similar demands are around police on campus, curriculum, more Black teachers, that kind of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to say, right, like, I also think that those criticisms of Black Lives Matter really get Dr. King wrong over and over. Dr. King is saying disruption is necessary over and over. Dr. King is saying, talking about police brutality over and over. Dr. King is saying, is criticizing the role of liberals and moderates and sort of saying they're with the movement. So I think that gets Dr. King wrong. But I also think it really misses, right? I think there's a way we tend to kind of look back on the civil rights movement, and again, it's like sepia toned, and it sort of seems like all the decent people were with it. And it really was not, right? Most Americans during the civil rights movement did not approve of the civil rights movement. And that, even if that's not just a product of the South. For instance, in 1964, the New York Times surveys New Yorkers, and a majority of New Yorkers think the civil rights movement has gone too far.
Wow.
In 64, so this is the year before the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things that these New Yorkers are reacting to is a growing movement in New York City around sort of school equity and school desegregation. That had culminated in the winter of 1964, February 3rd, 1964, with a massive school boycott. Almost 500,000 students and teachers stay out of New York City public schools, right, to protest a lack of even a plan for comprehensive desegregation in the city. And part of what's happening in New York City at this point is the city schools are segregated. They're growing more segregated, again, because this is a period where more and more sort of African-American and Puerto Ricans are moving to New York City. And schools in Black and Latino neighborhoods are growing more and more overcrowded. One of the Board of Ed's suggestions, again, in the early 60s, is not, in fact, to sort of even out sort of schools by desegregating them, but to sort of move Black and Latino schools to double session days. So basically some kids go during the first half of the day and some kids go to the second half of the day. So you have a growing movement in the city, parents, young people, some teachers, that culminates, right, in what is the largest protest of the 1960s, right? We typically think of that as the March on Washington, but actually the numbers of the school boycott in New York City are almost twice as many. And we're going to see these kinds of school walkouts and school boycotts, again, throughout the late 60s, particularly as high school students, again, as you mentioned, in LA, in Boston, in New York, in many cities, sort of walk out of schools protesting, right, overcrowding, protesting things like not even adequate, like bathrooms, protesting the lack of Black and Latino history in the curriculum, protesting the lack of Black and Latino faculty, protesting, police on campus. So there's a whole huge wave of school walkouts in the late 1960s by both sort of Black and Latino students. And I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of talking about kind of the interconnections between kind of African American and Latino history in that period.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that history. And I think there's just so many rich lessons that I think we need to continue to read about and think about how they apply to our own time period. And I'm really looking forward to these breakout sessions that we're going to have in a moment to see what kind of questions come out of that, of those sessions. So we're going to pause here in just a moment so you can meet some fellow participants and process what you've been hearing. And we will automatically place you into breakout groups of 5 to 6.
What are the stakes in not getting this history in school, right? And how does learning the history of youth activism help us think about where we are today or what we could do today?
Excellent.
We're going to be talking about that kind of after we return.
We jump into questions. I'm excited to hear from a couple of young activists that we have with us here today. And I'm going to start by turning it over to Jeanne to introduce our first student activist.
So I live in Brooklyn, and so one of the movements that I've been really sort of inspired by here in New York City is a movement of young people called Teens Take Charge. And in many ways, Teens Take Charge is carrying on sort of some of the work we were just talking about in terms of the struggle for desegregation and school equity here in New York City. Sometimes I ask my students, when did New York City schools desegregate? And it's a trick question because, of course, they didn't.
Right.
So I wanted to welcome, I think there are a handful of people from Teens Take Charge, but I wanted to ask Karma Selsey kind of to introduce herself and also to introduce kind of some of the work that Teens Take Charge is doing here in New York City. Karma?
Hi, I'm Karma. I'm a senior at New York City Lab School and an incoming freshman at Brown University. Right now, Teens Take Charge, well, for those of you who don't know, Teens Take Charge is essentially a youth-led educational equity organization, and we started in 2017, and our origins were actually student testimony, which is basically just students sharing about their experiences living in a segregated school system in the modern day when the narrative is generally that segregation is completely over. But we also engage in direct action, and that can look like anything from a small meeting with a few representatives and people from the DOE or a large protest. Last year on June 6th, we had a rally on the steps of the DOE's office right across from City Hall. And so right now, obviously, we're not able to organize protests like that, but what's been happening recently is the Summer Youth Employment Program, which is basically a New York City-based program where we're about 75,000 students every summer based on a lottery get the chance to engage with paid internships or jobs over the summer. That program has been canceled, and the Mayor de Blasio stated public health and safety concerns, even though it's kind of clear that that's not really the full truth, because a lot of CBOs and organizations that normally hold positions for SYEP were more than ready to offer remote and virtual enrichment opportunities via SYEP, and they can't do that without the program. So we recently started a petition, which I'll make sure that I share in the chat after this, to kind of urge de Blasio to take action and to rethink what he's doing, because he talks a lot about injustice and he claims to be a very progressive person, but when it comes to actually changing the system and not just trying to save face, he usually doesn't step up. So we've, based on a call on Brian Lehrer with WNYC, with Speaker Corey Johnson, our representative from TTC, kind of helped convince some members of City Council to kind of be on board with this and help urge de Blasio to reinstate SYEP and allow for enrichment opportunities over the summer, so that we don't actually have a public health and safety concern where a bunch of young people are just outside over the summer and they don't have anything to do. There's statistics that we know SYEP decreases violence. So, you know, if you're really worried about public health and safety, then you would be worried about these kinds of things as opposed to just allowing them to continue.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us today.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent work, Karma. We wish you all the best in your struggles, and looking forward to hearing about a victory out there soon. So I want to now introduce Jaeden Thomas, who's a senior at Franklin High School here in Seattle, where we live. And he's been a member of the NAACP Youth Council for the past couple years, and he has served as one of the council's vice presidents for the past year. And Jaeden uses his voice as an advocate for students and families, and I've seen that myself. The Black Lives Matter at School movement, he's been a participant in. I saw his brilliant dance troupe perform at our Young, Gifted, and Black talent showcase to wrap up the Black Lives Matter at School week. And he's also been a leader in the fight for ethnic studies that he's going to talk to you all more about now. So Jaeden, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, as Jesse mentioned, I am a part of the NAACP Youth Council here in Seattle, Washington. And in the NAACP Youth Council, but for short, we call it NYC. I know that can kind of be confusing because we have people from New York there. But in the NYC, we have a list of demands, and one of our demands is the fight for ethnic studies. And ever since I joined the council about 2 years ago, that's been one of our main focuses, is fighting for ethnic studies to be taught in classes and at all grade levels. Because in the Seattle Public School District, ethnic studies at one point was offered as an elective class, but we wanted it to have mandated, so everybody has to take it at all times and throughout. They learn about it from kindergarten through 12th grade. A lot of people don't get it until they're in high school, and then sadly the program was cut. The person who was fighting to keep it in the schools and was building up the curriculum, it was cut for reasons beyond their control. So we're really at this point, we're still fighting to get the budget back into the built back into Seattle Public Schools for it to be made available for all students. Because as I said in the small group discussions, history just really repeats itself. The conversations that we're having right now, that we're talking about, are conversations that my grandparents were fighting for, that my parents are fighting for, and now me being 18, we're still fighting for the same things. We've come so far, but we really have a far way to go for it to be equal, or to be an ideal situation that we want. So yeah, so like I said, in our list of demands with ethnic studies, we are also part of, a couple of us in the council are still working on trying to build the curriculum as well. We have representatives who help build the curriculum for all the courses. And like I said, for each specific grade level, we have people that have gone into the schools to some kindergartens, to some kindergarten classrooms. And then we have a few people that have taught some ethnic study lessons at their Sunday school, because we had people that work for Sunday schools. And so, yeah, that's really our fight at the moment. That's one of our fights. We have a lot of other demands that we're working on to just build up the voice for the youth in Seattle Public Schools, and also in all schools, because we want to see equity for all the children. So thank you.
Right on. Thank you so much, Jaeden, for sharing that.
Thank you.
And people should really know that the NAACP Youth Council was one of the main driving forces that actually got the Seattle School District to form an ethnic studies department and to demand that every child have the right to learn about the ethnic and cultural diversity that makes up the Seattle schools. And you all have been an inspiration to me, so keep up your struggle.
Thank you.
Right on. Well, I just want to remind people that this session goes until 3:15 Eastern today. But if you have to leave early, please fill out the evaluation before you go. The link is in the chat box, and you can continue responding to questions from the chat box. And so we want to have a little bit of time for questions that may have come up in the groups, or maybe people have questions for our guest student activist presenters. I'll start with one question for Professor Theoharis that came up when we were speaking, and then I'll look through the chat and see if there's some more questions. But I was hoping you could talk to the group more about Diane Nash and how the freedom rides got started and the role of young people in seeing those through.
Right. So just so we know where our timeline is, the student sit-ins start in the winter, spring of 1960, right? And that first meeting of SNCC happens in April 60. And then they have a second meeting. And then in 1961, a group, Congress of Racial Equality, decides to organize the freedom rides. And the idea behind the freedom rides is that the Supreme Court has made two different decisions. One saying that interstate bus travel must be desegregated, and that's actually a decision they make in the 1940s. But then they'd also made a second decision the previous year that bus terminals that serve interstate buses also had to be desegregated. And so what CORE decides they're going to do is they're going to organize a freedom ride to try to force the federal government to enforce its own laws. Because in fact, even though the Supreme Court had ruled this, in parts of the United States, it wasn't being upheld. And so the idea behind the freedom ride is that they would basically ride from DC, they'd get on the bus in DC and they'd ride all the way down through the South and end up originally in New Orleans, although that's not where they end up ultimately. And that they would test both the bus itself, but also the bus terminals. And so they head out, and it's an interracial group. I think it's 13 people, both Black and white, and they're doing okay until they get to Alabama. And they're riding two different buses. One's a Trailway, one the Greyhound, and they encounter massive violence. One bus in Anniston, Alabama, and is firebombed, and then the second bus in Birmingham, the Klan attacks it. The police know it's going to happen, and they give the Klan 15 minutes to attack it. The FBI knows this is going to happen. They stand by. So there's this massive violence, and the Freedom Riders get very hurt. Nobody gets killed, but they get very hurt. And basically CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, decides that this violence is even worse than they'd expected. And so they need to suspend the rides. And SNCC, and in particular Diane Nash, who was a young woman who had grown up in Chicago, but was attending Fisk University in Nashville, decides that can't happen. That basically to suspend the freedom rides, and there were young people on the freedom rides, would be to let violence win. And these SNCC young people were very worried that the message would go out to white segregationists, that all it would take is violence, and that both you would see this uptake in violence, but also that there was this sense that the movement could be defeated. And so these young people, in the midst of this incredible violence, are like, we're going to continue this. And the Kennedys are Diane Nash drives the Kennedys crazy, right? Because they don't want to, they see this as a problem. They see this as getting in the way of their foreign policy. They think it's making the United States look bad. They don't, and they they think the Freedom Riders are making the United States look bad. But SNCC is undeterred. And so they basically send young people down to pick up the rides again in Alabama. And they encounter massive violence again in Montgomery. Massive violence. People sustain permanent injuries. Both white and Black people who join the SNCC part of the ride. And yet they keep going. And they basically force the Kennedy's hand. And I think, again, this is not, many of us may have heard of the Freedom Rides, but I think the ways that young people like basically play this decisive role, right, in saying we can't let violence win, and going when older people had been like, no, maybe this is too much, I think is not always the way we tell that story.
Yeah, thank you. So we're getting a few questions in that I want to try to get to here in our remaining time. One question that came in from RNT80 said they would love to hear Dr. Theoharis contextualize these two eras in terms of a timeline. Are we collectively expecting the youth to move too fast and accomplish too much in too short of a time period? So maybe just lay out.
That's a lot of questions. Right. So we haven't talked that much, but I don't want to miss the role that, because we've spent a lot of time talking about Southern young people, and certainly one of the things that happens in the later 60s, and obviously we talked a little bit about 64 in New York City, but in the later 60s, you have student walkouts happening in many, many northern cities and many western cities. And again, these walkouts in some ways are picking up where kind of parents and community members in many of these cities have been struggling, for instance, in Boston, around issues of school equity for more than a decade at this point. And then young people kind of step in and are like, we're going to take the struggle kind of into the high schools and we're going to start walking out. And so you see all these walkouts in like 68, 69, 70, protesting many things that are unfortunately still with us, right? Lack of ethnic studies in the curriculum, not enough diverse teachers, not working bathrooms, not good facility science or music, not as good as some other kids are getting. And so to me, and I think we see this activism come back in terms of student walkouts every couple decades, where we see young people having to pick up the same fight. And I think we're in another moment of this, right? Where we see the same kinds of conditions, unequal resources. And the other thing that I think we see today that we also saw 50, 60 years ago is in northern and western cities, they didn't want to be seen like they're like Southerners. They didn't want to be seen as segregationists. They didn't want to be seen as like racist. And so how they often justified their unequal schools was by what I call, and what scholars call, culture of poverty ideas, by this idea that Black and Latino families and communities had developed behaviors, dysfunctional sort of behaviors or values that got in the way of school success. And so the reason that Black students or Puerto Rican students, Chicano students were struggling in school was because their communities didn't properly value education, or they didn't have the right values for success. And right. These kinds of arguments come back to, like, we see all the time today to justify like the kind of inequality we see in schools today. And so to me, one of the things that I really, I think is really useful about studying these movements of the late 60s and these young people walkouts is that they're pushing back explicitly on this idea that we don't value school, we don't have the right values for success, and kind of forcing the issue. And because one of the things that you're going to see school officials, again, in LA and Boston and New York, basically saying is, we don't have inferior schools, we have inferior students, right? And using these kind of like language around problem kids. And again, it's a language that I think we see today again, right? We see there's this whole myth that like Black students don't value education the way other students do, right? But it's a myth that is used to justify kind of the unequal sort of resources, unequal access to college prep. Again, one of the things they're fighting for in these school walkouts in the late 60s is also access to college classes. Not enough And again, we see that in struggles today. And I think certainly we can't expect high school students to have to like bear the brunt of this activism, right? And I think what we have to do is imagine movements where high school and college students are sort of leading, but also where parents, teachers, community members are also leading. Because again, this cannot fall on the kind of backs and shoulders of young people only.
Thank you so much. So there's a couple questions for our student activists I'd like to get to. Let's see, Mason said, I'd love to ask Jaeden and Karma what or who inspired them to be so engaged at a young age, and if they've encountered obstacles or resistance specific to their age. And then somebody else asked, let's see, Katie Orr said, for Jaeden and Karma, how can adults help non-political students get involved in activism, not just signing an online petition? How can we inspire them to go somewhere and take action? So Karma, and maybe Karma first and then Jaeden, if you all are interested in answering those questions.
Yeah, sure. So for the first question about how I kind of got involved with this work, I think for me really starts back when I was really young and when I kind of realized that like systemic injustice was a thing, and that my race and gender kind of like matter to people in ways that they really shouldn't. So right before I turned 10, a couple weeks before I turned 10, Trayvon Martin died, and I went to a predominantly Black elementary school, and the next day, or whenever the next time we had school was, we all just kind of like collectively decided to wear Black hoodies kind of like in solidarity with each other. And that was kind of when I realized like, whoa, something's wrong with our country and with the world and the way that we interact with each other. And so once I got to middle school and mainly high school, because I have a lot more opportunities for activism now, I figured like now that I'm older and I have more independence, I sort of owe it to myself and to my community to do whatever I can. And so in junior year, I kind of came across Teens Take Charge, and I found out that they were doing their rally on the steps of Tweed Courthouse, and that was just kind of it for me. And I've been really involved ever since. And I also do some work in the climate justice movement. I'm not as heavily involved in that, but overall, yeah, I just think that it was really that moment when I was almost 10 that just kind of made all the lessons that my parents had taught me about how I have to act differently and how I have to always comply with the police and with authority. Like that's kind of when it all clicked for me. And then for the second question, I think it's really just about making people understand why certain issues either affect them or affect people that they know, because I think that it's really difficult for people to kind of get involved with certain movements if they don't have some sort of personal stake in it. And so it's not necessarily about using all of this like really fancy jargon and like all these like complicated definitions of things. But like, for example, if I were to explain the ways that school segregation affects people that I go to school with, I'm in a co-located building, and the floor below me has none of the resources that my predominantly white school has. And so it's something like as easy as that. I could make somebody realize, oh, this is unfair.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I love the way you described your intersectional approach to understanding how racism and sexism overlap, and then taking up other issues like climate change and how all these issues are interwoven. Thank you for sharing that. Jaeden? Jaeden, I think you're muted. If you want to say anything about what inspired you to become an activist. Did we lose him? All right, maybe we'll move on to the next question, and if Jaeden comes back, then we can always squeeze him back in and see if there is any lessons he wants to share with us. Let's see, okay, so there's a question about ethnic studies that I think is worth us thinking about. Somebody said, I'm interested in teaching all classes with an ethnic studies lens versus teaching an actual class called ethnic studies. Which approach would be better in the long run? Maybe I'll say a quick word about that as somebody who has done both. And then Jeanne, if you have any perspective on that too, let me know. But I think that that both are valuable and that we should struggle for both. I think that we need to fight to integrate ethnic studies approach into all of the existing courses, because right now the standard American history courses are mostly Eurocentric history courses, right? They mostly teach a white people's history. And I think part of the struggle in Seattle that's been so brilliant is to say, we want ethnic studies K-12, and we also want it integrated into the current curriculum. And there's been some incredible, mostly women of color, who have really led that struggle here in Seattle. Tracy Castro-Gill, who led this struggle and then became the director before she was forced out for her advocacy. And people like Rita Green from the NAACP and many others wanted this to be integrated into the current classes. And I think that's such a powerful message to say there's something wrong with the way all of our classes are being taught, and we want to change that. And I think that's very valuable. At the same time, I've also taught an ethnic studies class that's a standalone course. And I think some of the power of having a standalone course is that the students who are in it know that they are in a course that's part of a tradition that started with young people, right? And so that young college students in 1968 and 69 and in Berkeley and in San Francisco State, led the longest student strikes in US history and shut the campus down, demanding that they get to learn about their own histories that have been forced out, and getting to walk into a class called ethnic studies and learn that it was young people that fought to get that class, I've found brings a new kind of attention and urgency for students in that course. And so I think that there's value in having that course at the same time we fight to integrate the ethnic studies approach into the existing courses.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that in a couple of different ways. Part of what we are trying to do, even in this little mini course, is to sort of show that even if there's not space, and here I think I'm talking a tiny bit more to educators, although students I think would agree, that like even if you have to teach a particular curriculum with a particular textbook, that there are different ways to teach the stories that are in there, right? Because I think sometimes we're like, we want to have an ethnic studies class, or we want to have an ethnic studies curriculum, and then the political forces where we are make that impossible. And so in some sense, we get a bit paralyzed. And so I think part of why we were doing this little mini course anyways, and we started with Rosa Parks and today, is that some of the stories that are in the books, right? Whether it's Rosa Parks, whether it's Brown v. Board, whether it's what King did in Birmingham, are stories that we can teach differently, talk about differently, understand the lessons differently. But I think like Jesse's saying, I mean, I was an African-American studies major in college, and I'm right now teaching the class I'm teaching at Brooklyn College is a class on the civil rights and Black Power movements. It's not American history. It's expressly just focused on this time period. And I think I think like ethnic studies perspectives need to be all over the curriculum, but to me, that's not the only way we do it. And that to have classes where, like African American studies classes, where we are just studying sort of the civil rights and Black power movements, are so amazing and valuable too. And so I think we can want both, struggle for both. But again, at base, even if the political forces where you live make both of those impossible, that doesn't mean that we have to sort of put up with the stories that we're given.
Yes.
And so I guess I would want us to understand, no matter what we have access to, we can do differently.
Right on. Well, Jeanne, I don't know if you have any last thoughts about why this history is important for us today and where we go forward with this. We have a last minute before we need to move to evaluations.
I guess my last thing would be, I guess it's sort of where we started, kind of 2 points that I just wanted to kind of finish with. And I think the first is, what does it mean to center and to sort of see that young people in so many parts of the civil rights movement, that even that we know of, young people are in the vanguard. And they are in the vanguard at moments and in ways that are making adults in their community, Black and white adults, very uncomfortable. And I think we need to understand that and reckon with it, because I think part of why my book is called A More Beautiful and Terrible History. It's from a James Baldwin quote, where he's talking about American history, and Baldwin writes, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything that anyone's ever said about it.
Yes.
It's a beautiful quote, and I think it gets to how we often sand off the edges of the history we tell. And I think we don't talk about the way that young people led, and we don't talk about the ways that they were often opposed. And so then when we get into the present, and here we are in the midst of new movements where some of, and adults in our communities are nervous about those movements, we can put that in historical perspective and say, that's been true all along, right? That movements are not necessarily embraced in the moment that they are in. And to sort of carry that with us, that your righteousness is not necessarily going to be recognized in the moment. And I think that's a really important lesson, because I think oftentimes, because of the way history is told, it's very kind of demoralizing, right? Because struggle is so hard, right? And because the way that we're taught is like somehow Rosa Parks sits down and then everybody realizes there's an injustice and we band together, and we forget that's in fact not exactly how it worked. And so I guess that's where I would want us to sort of leave us, that the picture we've been given of the civil rights movement, it was a much harder than we've been given, and the young people really sort of led the way in many of the places that we are now most proud of today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing those lessons for me. I just feel like they're much sharper in my own mind, and I'm going to be more effective in my instruction this year. And I hope the same is for many educators here, and students all enjoyed this, and we'd love to get your feedback. And so we hope that everybody fills out the feedback form. Just before we do that, I want to say folks should definitely get Jeanne Theoharis's book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the uses and misuses of civil rights history. People can follow Professor Theoharis on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter. You can go to the Zinn Education Project website and get many lessons for how to teach this history. There's a great one about teaching SNCC I would highly recommend all educators check out. And so we've put the link to the comment form in the chat box, but before doing the valuation, please unmute and shout out the you have.
Thank you, Professor Theoharis. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you.
everybody.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you
Very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
For everybody, we're doing the struggle in the North and the West next week, right? So the struggle outside the South. So we're really going to be focusing on kind of what the civil rights movement looked like outside of the South. So please join us next Friday at 2 if you want to kind of continue this, again, looking at the struggle outside the South.
Yes, we'd love to have you all back. Looking forward to continuing that conversation next week. So now you can mute yourselves again and complete the evaluation form. I hope you all stay healthy and safe. And I'm wishing you and your loved ones the best in this difficult time, and solidarity in the struggle.
Thank you.
Thanks for class.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you very much.
How do I complete the evaluation? Is your Hagopian?
So I think there's a link in the chat box. If you scroll through the chat, there's a link and you can click on that. And then go to.
It lists a link, but when you hit it, it doesn't go automatically.
Oh, you have to copy and paste
You have
it.
to copy and paste.
Okay, copy
Right.
it, select it, and then copy and paste it into the web browser. And then,
Thank you. Thank you.
and Deborah, I don't know if you have any freedom music to send us home. The freedom songs. That was a nice.
Happy to, yeah. Yeah. We'll do Bernice Johnson Reagan. There's a new world coming.
All right, we'll listen to that, and I'll sign off. Thanks, everybody.